I find this article and this topic in general to be pretty interesting, and I wanted to share it in case it can help anyone out there. Why sexual morality may be far more important than you ever thought. One winter afternoon, I was relaxing with a half dozen fellow graduate philosophy students, discussing theories of law and punishment. About an hour into the discussion, it occurred to me that some moral laws might limit pleasure and enjoyment in the short term, but in the long term minimize suffering and maximize human fulfillment. A few days ago, I finished studying Sex and Culture for the second time. It is a remarkable book summarizing a lifetime of research by Oxford social anthropologist J.D. Unwin. The 600-plus page book is, in Unwin's words, only a summary of his research. 7 volumes would be required to lay it all out. His writings suggest he was a rationalist, believing that science is our ultimate tool of inquiry. It appears he was not a religious man. As I went through what he found, I was repeatedly reminded of the thought I had as a philosophy student. Some moral laws may be designed to minimize human suffering and maximize human flourishing long term. Unwin examines the data from 86 societies and civilizations, to see if there is a relationship between sexual freedom and the flourishing of cultures. What makes the book especially interesting is that we in the West underwent a sexual revolution in the late 1960s, 70s, and 80s, and are now in a position to test the conclusions he arrived at more than 40 years earlier. Unwin described 4 great patterns of human culture and degrees of flourishing measured in terms of architecture, art, engineering, literature, agriculture, and so forth. The primary criterion for classification was how they related to the natural world and the forces it contains. Number 1, zoistic, entirely self-focused on day-to-day life, wants, and needs, with no interest in understanding nature, described as a dead culture or inert. Number 2, monistic, acquire superstitious beliefs and or special treatment of the dead to cope with the natural world. Number 3, deistic, attribute the powers of nature to a god or gods. And 4, rationalistic, use rational thinking to understand nature and to make day-to-day decisions. Unwin's degrees of sexual restraint. Degrees of sexual restraint were divided into 2 major categories, prenuptial and postnuptial, or pre-marriage and post-marriage. Premarital categories were 1, complete sexual freedom, no premarital restraints at all. 2, irregular or occasional restraint. Cultural regulations require an occasional period of abstinence. Or number 3, strict chastity. Remain a virgin until married. Postnuptial categories were modified monogamy, 1 spouse at a time, but association can be terminated by either party. Modified polygamy, men can have more than 1 wife, but a wife is free to leave her husband. Absolute monogamy, only 1 spouse permitted for life or until death in some cultures. Or absolute polygamy, men can have more than 1 wife, but wives must confine their sexual activity to their husband for the whole of their lives. I have prepared a 26-page collection of quotes from his book that summarize his findings, but even that would leave you with a significant underappreciation of the rigor and fascinating details revealed in data from 86 cultures. Here are a few of his most significant findings. Number 1, the effect of sexual constraint. Increased sexual constraints, either pre or post-marriage, always led to increased flourishing of a culture. Conversely, increased sexual freedom always led to the collapse of a culture 3 generations later. Number 2, single most influential factor. Surprisingly, the data revealed that the single most important correlation with the flourishing of a culture was whether premarital chastity was required or not. It had a very significant effect either way. 3, highest flourishing of a culture. The most powerful combination was prenuptial chastity coupled with absolute monogamy. Rationalist cultures that retained this combination for at least 3 generations exceeded all other cultures in every area, including literature, art, science, furniture, architecture, engineering, and agriculture. Only 3 out of the 86 cultures studied ever attained this level. 4, effect of abandoning premarital chastity. When strict premarital chastity was no longer the norm, absolute monogamy, deism, and rational thinking also disappeared within 3 generations. 5, total sexual freedom. If total sexual freedom was embraced by a culture, that culture collapsed within 3 generations to the lowest state of flourishing, which Unwin describes as inert and at a dead level of conception, and is characterized by people who have little interest in much else other than their own wants and needs.
Catch me outside, how about that?
Huh?
Catch me outside, how about that?
At this level, the culture is usually conquered or taken over by another culture with greater social energy. 6, time lag. If there is a change in sexual constraints, either increased or decreased restraints, the full effect of that change is not realized until the 3rd generation. How does this compare with our culture today? Unwin published his findings in 1934, long before the sexual revolution that occurred in the West. We now have an opportunity to test his conclusions by observing if our own culture is following the predicted pattern. Unwin's generation appears to be approximately 33 years, so it should take about a century for us to see the cultural changes take full effect, but we are far enough along in the process that we should be able to observe certain predicted effects. Prior to the sexual revolution, which began in the late 1960s, premarital chastity was still held in strong regard by Western culture. But starting in the 1970s, premarital sexual freedom became increasingly acceptable. By the early 2000s, the majority of teens were sexually active, to the extent that remaining a virgin until marriage was regarded with disbelief, if not ridicule. At the same time, our culture moved from a social norm of absolute monogamy to modified monogamy. Unwin's predictions for our culture. Thanks to the rationalist generations that preceded them, the first generation of a society setting aside its sexual restraints can still enjoy its newfound sexual freedom before any significant decline in culture. But the data shows that this having your cake and eating it too phase lasts a maximum of 1 generation before the decline sets in. Unwin wrote, "The history of these societies consists of a series of monotonous repetitions, and is difficult to decide which aspect of the story is more significant, the lamentable lack of original thought, which in each case the reformers displayed, or the amazing alacrity with which, after a period of intense compulsory continence or sexual restraint, the human organism seizes the earliest opportunity to satisfy its innate desires in a direct or perverted manner. Sometimes a man has been heard to declare that he wishes both to enjoy the advantages of high culture and to abolish compulsory continence. The inherent nature of the human organism, however, seems to be such that these desires are incompatible, even contradictory. The reformer may be likened to the foolish boy who desires both to keep his cake and to consume it. Any human society is free to choose either to display great energy or to enjoy sexual freedom. The evidence is that it cannot do both for more than one generation. Looking at our own sexual revolution, the having your cake and eating it too phase would have lasted into the early 2000s. We are now at a stage where we should begin to observe the verification or falsification of Unwin's predictions. Unwin found that when strict premarital chastity was abandoned, absolute monogamy, deism, and rational thinking disappeared within 3 generations of the change in sexual freedom. So how are we doing as we enter the 2nd generation since our own sexual revolution at the end of the 20th century? As predicted, absolute monogamy has already been replaced with modified monogamy. Common law relationships are becoming the norm. Although divorce occurred prior to the 1970s, the mainstream of our culture still maintained the view that marriage should be for life, and common law relationships were regarded with some distaste. That has clearly changed. Those who actually practice lifelong commitments in marriage have become the minority, with couples born prior to the sexual revolution much more likely to maintain a lifelong commitment in marriage. Deism is already rapidly declining, exactly as predicted. Prior to the 1960s, a combination of rationalism and a belief in God was the norm for mainstream culture. Not only has belief in God greatly decreased since the 1960s, but there has been a trend to remove the concept of God from government, the educational system, and the public forum. Those who still believe in God sense a strong societal pressure to keep deistic beliefs private. In its place is a surprising rise in superstition, classified by Unwin as a monistic culture, 2 levels down from the rationalist culture we had prior to the sexual revolution. There has also been a huge increase in the percentage of the population that classifies itself as non-religious, a symptom of the lowest zoistic level of Unwin's categories. The swiftness with which rational thinking declined after the 1970s is astounding. In its place arose postmodernism, good old postmodernism, characterized by skepticism, subjectivism, or relativism, and a general suspicion of reason. But it gets worse. Postmodernism is giving way to post-truth. In direct contrast to rational thinking, a post-truth culture abandons shared objective standards for truth and instead stands on appeals to feelings and emotions and what one wants to believe. People can now identify themselves as something which flat out contradicts science and rational thinking and, in many cases, receive the full support and backing of governments and educational systems. Not only do people feel they have a right to believe what they want, but any challenge to that belief, even if supported by truth and logic, is unacceptable and offensive.
Well, this is one of the problems with this left-wing gender ideology, is that no one who espouses it can even tell you what these words mean. It's like, what is a woman?
Well,
Can you tell me what a woman is?
No, I can't. Because it's not for me to say. Womanhood looks different for everybody.
What do you define a woman as?
An adult human female.
And what does a female mean?
Well,
how
that's
do you define a female?
someone with female reproductive organs.
Okay.
Someone who's, here's the thing, when you're female, it goes right down to your bones, your DNA. So that's why if someone dies,
Okay.
we could dig up their bones 100 years from now. We have no idea what they believed in their head, but we can tell what sex they were because it's ingrained in every fiber of their being.
Interesting. So I'm trying to understand. Your definition is that a woman is someone who is female, you said, right?
Correct, is a
Okay.
biological female.
So what happens if we have maybe someone who is female, identifies as a woman, right? You know, cisgender woman, right? As you just explained, but maybe doesn't have the ability to reproduce. Maybe doesn't have those organs that you're talking about that are reproductive organs.
I have answered the question. You stood up here and said trans women are women.
Yes.
Tell me what you mean. What is a woman?
Womanhood is something that, just as Ethan explained, I cannot define because I am not
But
myself.
you used the word, so what did you mean when you said trans women are women if you don't know what it means?
Right? So here's the thing. So I do not define what a woman is because I do not identify as a woman. Womanhood is something that is an umbrella term. It includes people
That describes what?
people who identify as a woman.
Identify as what?
As a woman.
What is that?
Was to each their own. Each woman, each man, each person is going to have a different relation with their own gender identity and define it differently.
That doesn't,
and so
I'm not
Postmodernism is giving way to post-truth. In direct contrast to rational thinking, a post-truth culture abandons shared objective standards for truth and instead stands on appeals to feelings and emotions and what one wants to believe. People can now identify themselves as something which flat out contradicts science and rational thinking and, in many cases, receive the full support and backing of governments and educational systems. Not only do people feel they have a right to believe what they want, but any challenge to that belief, even if supported by truth and logic, is unacceptable and offensive.
women are women too.
Okay.
And you want to hold on.
Say it again. Trans
You
women
want
are
to
women.
reduce.
What you
listen,
won't
listen.
even tell me
You
what
want
the
to
word
reduce,
means, though. So
you
that's
want to
the
reduce
problem.
women. You want to reduce men down to maybe just their genetics, our genitals,
No.
our chromosomes, right? That's what you're
What
saying.
you want to
that
do is
that's what,
what
we
you
are at the end of the
you
day.
want to do is appropriate women. You want to appropriate womanhood
Okay.
and turn it into basically a costume that could be worn.
Summary of where our culture is going, given Unwin's findings. For the first part of the 1900s, mainstream Western culture was rationalist and experienced enormous technological advances. From horse and buggy to cars, from hot air balloons to supersonic flight and spacecraft landing people on the moon, from slide rules to computers. Unwin's three main predictions, the abandonment of rationalism, deism, and absolute monogamy, are all well underway, which makes the ultimate prediction appear to be credible. The collapse of Western civilization in the third generation, somewhere in the last third of this century. Will our culture be the exception? I suppose we can hope, but there is always a tendency to want to believe it cannot happen to us. Unwin describes this attitude as a pardonable egocentricity and a quaint and comfortable doctrine that flies in the face of data, which indicate that the pattern of decline happens with monotonous regularity. That's another way of saying that insanity is doing the same thing yet again, but expecting different results. The primary predictions are already unfolding with alarming alacrity. Why is there such a monotonous perfect inverse correlation? The old adage correlation does not entail causation probably holds true here as well. Unwin makes it clear that he does not know why sexual freedom directly leads to the decline and collapse of cultures, although he suggests that when sexual energy is restrained through celibacy or monogamy, it is diverted into more productive social energy. Perhaps, but I find it difficult to accept it as a primary cause. Mary Eberstadt's recent research into mass killings, the substantial rise in mental health issues, including depression, and the explosion of identity politics is a primal scream due to the loss of identity that was once provided by growing up in a long-term immediate family with siblings and a sizable group of cousins, aunts, and uncles, all of which provided identity essential for well-being. Eberstadt shows and documents from various studies that this decimation of the family was a direct consequence of the sexual revolution at the end of the 20th century.
The rates of depression and anxiety among teenagers have increased by 70% in the past 25 years. the number of children and young people turning up in accident and emergency departments with a psychiatric condition has more than doubled since 2009. And in the past 3 years, hospital admissions for teenagers with eating disorders have also almost doubled.
Homecoming next weekend. Gentlemen, stop dilly-dally.
I have a lot of friends, myself included, that struggle a lot with depression and anxiety. And like sometimes it's not even like there's something wrong, it's just that there's something wrong. And like you don't exactly know why or how you're supposed to fix it or feel better. A lot of times I personally go and I turn to like just isolating myself, and I don't want to be around my friends.
63% of youth suicides are from fatherless homes, U.S. Department of Health census. 90% of all homeless and runaway children are from fatherless homes, 32 times the average. 85% of all children who show behavior disorders come from fatherless homes, Center for Disease Control. 80% of rapists with anger problems come from fatherless homes, 14 times the average. Justice and Behavior, Volume 14, pages 403 to 426. 71% of all high school dropouts come from fatherless homes, 9 times the average. National Principals Association report. Father factor in education. Fatherless children are twice as likely to drop out of school, and these statistics just go on and on and on.
What about porn? Do guys all watch porn?
Okay, I didn't even realize that, but pretty much every guy has an addiction to it, but no one talks about it. So say I'm talking to them about it, and I'll be like, oh, does that guy do it too? And they're like, yeah, and I'm like, that sweet innocent boy watches it too, everyone does.
No, everyone watches it.
How many guys and girls do you guys know that watch porn?
I'd say all guys, pretty much.
I think I know one guy in my school. I think I've talked to one that I can confidently say hasn't, and nobody else.
You know, it's very prevalent, and everybody knows it.
They watch porn for fun. They don't even watch it for any sexual release. They just watch it to watch it.
Do you think parents really have any clue of how significant of an issue pornography is in kids?
No, they're pretty clueless. Yeah.
In 2019, porn sites received more traffic than Amazon, Twitter, and Netflix combined each month. 26% of adolescents aged 13 to 17 actively seek out pornography.
What's that? What
weekly
percentage?
or more.
It is on every platform, even the platforms that parents think it's not on. Just for example, Twitter, which is one that most adults probably use. They probably know Twitter.
Snapchat is where explicit content on Pornhub lives just seconds away from every user through backdoors within the app. The app knowingly allows a well-documented list of porn performers to make thousands of dollars daily through their premium Snap accounts.
The people behind pornography know how to optimize their content for search terms.
Pornographers, any new technology that comes out, they immediately saturate it. They know about it before, as it's getting ready to come out, and they are ready with every strategy to saturate it.
What age did watching porn become common?
I'd say 7th grade.
Yeah, middle school.
9th and 10th grade, I remember guys being like, yeah, I had an issue in 7th grade, and I'm like, I'm sorry, what?
What I say to parents is it's time for every parent on earth to leave the ignorance of the land of if and embrace the reality of when.
The film we'll see this morning will give the answers to these questions. It will also show the earliest phases of growth, as well as the changes that take place during childhood and adolescence.
So when my parents were addressing the birds and the bees with me, there was no conversation.
I walked out more confused after the conversation than when it started.
We don't talk about those things at all.
No, sex. Sex. Wait.
It's absolutely normal to be curious about sexuality. It's normal to be interested.
Don't have sex, because you will get pregnant and die. Just don't do it, promise? Okay, everybody take some rubbers.
My dad had conversations with me when I was a teenage girl. Like, I asked him, and he was very blunt and just told me.
Do you think kids are using pornography as sex education?
Yeah.
Okay.
Because I feel like they don't want to like talk to like a parent or like a guidance counselor or anything like that because it's awkward. Like it's an awkward topic to talk about.
Like I said, I have 3 classes right now, and they all are going like over like sex ed type things, and it's really boring. So a lot of the times I just kind of like tune it out.
This is a tool for sex education for a lot of children. They are learning so many wrong things, not only about sex, but about relationships.
Guys, especially our age, like, they just like watch porn to like be fulfilled in their own ways. So then they're just like if my girl can't do the same thing that these people are doing, like, then something's off. I don't want to be compared to like a porn star. Like,
Analysis of the 50 most popular porn videos found that 88% contain physical violence and 49% contain verbal aggression, mostly against women.
Wow. There's like certain guys that I've hooked up with, and I'm like, this is really aggressive, like this is too much for me. And then I'm like, and it's just terrible. I'm like, this is so bad. Like, because I haven't had sex yet, like people, or like the guys will like ask, and I'm like, no, I don't want to do that with you. And they're like, are you kidding me? Like, they get so mad.
Guys get this image in their head that that's how intimacy goes and that's how sex goes. And
there's definitely a bigger population of guys that feel that way now than there were even like 5 years ago.
Her research indicates that increased sexual freedom led to the decimation of the family, which resulted in the loss of family identity, which produces Everstat's primal screams, a massive increase in mental health issues, mass killings, and the rise of extreme identity groups at war with each other, all symptoms of a society rapidly spiraling into collapse. This appears to have greater explanatory power than Unwin's psychological suggestion, although the two may actually be closely related, given what Everstat shows. Both Unwin and Everstat provide substantial evidence that a sexual revolution has long-term devastating consequences for culture and civilization. As Unwin states, the history of these societies consists of a series of monotonous repetitions, and it appears that our civilization is following the same well-traveled road to collapse. So back to that afternoon in the philosophy seminar, when it occurred to me that some moral laws will seem to limit human pleasure in the short term, but will prevent great suffering or maximize happiness and fulfillment in the long term. Essentially the opposite of instant gratification. For years, it has been my thinking that God's moral laws are not simply a bunch of arbitrary rules given to restrict mankind's freedom. Instead, they are like operating instructions designed to spare people from suffering while maximizing human flourishing. Unwin's and Everstat's research provides strong rational justification for the inference that God's moral laws pertaining to our sexuality, although they may restrain us from some immediate pleasure, protect us from enormous long-term suffering while maximizing our long-term flourishing.